Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Let's Watch 2 podcast, a podcast with aspirations of discovering the ultimate double feature. My name is Sam, and joining me today is a very, very good friend of mine, Davy. How are you doing today, my friend?
Fine.
Thanks for that lengthy.
All right, okay. Well, fine-ish.
Wonderful. And today we're going to, as always, be talking about a double feature, and should really preface this episode by saying that half of this pairing has been programmed by like a pretty well-known filmmaker, Mr. Mark Cousins. Would you like to explain how we got Mark Cousins to program half of this double feature, Davy?
Sure, I asked him. This is great. These are all very short, glib answers today. Mark is very active on social media anyway. Anybody who wants to talk film, just interact with Mark. He's one of the great, not just documentarians of film of the last, I'd say, quarter century or so, but makes his own great films as well. And he, will go to all sorts of film festivals. You'll get to know him if you go around the UK circuit. And so I asked him, being a massive Nicolas Roeg fan, if he was to pair Bad Timing with one film, what would it be? With no context, so don't give us so we can come to a conclusion ourselves, but what would it be? And he offered up 1955's Summertime Madness, as it was originally known, by David Lean.
And an interesting pairing. We spoke briefly before I pressed records on this conversation, but I was watching. I've seen Bad Timing. So as you said, it's the Nick Roeg film from 1980. Maybe an underseen or underappreciated Nick Roeg film. It's one of my all-time favorite films, like top 20 material for me. And I know you're a very, very big fan of this film as well, which is why we wanted to talk about it. But we were sort of like not quite sure what to pair with this film. It has some difficult subject matter. It's a very controversial film, but it definitely deserves to be talked about. And I think it's a masterpiece. I'm sure you do too. But we were like, I'm not sure what to exactly put this with as a double feature pairing. And obviously, as you've just explained, Mark Cousins suggested this film. So when I was watching Summertime, I was trying to connect the dots or any threads that were a reason why Mark Cousins would have suggested this. And we'll get into it as we talk about the films individually. We'll talk about Summertime, or Summertime Madness, as it was known in the UK, first, as that was released chronologically. I will start off by saying I think I would, if I was to do this as a double feature, I would watch Bad Timing first, and then follow it up with Summertime, just for my mental well-being, I think. So first up, Davey, what is your history of David Lean, the director of Summertime?
Well, we lived together for a while in the 19th. No. So David Lean, I find to be a tremendously overrated filmmaker by some, in terms of his epics. I think David Lean's epic is Summertime, or is Brief Encounter. I think those are much more epic films than his actual epics, where people confuse the amount of cast or the scope of the film or the Jack Cardiff cinematography for epic. I find much more emotional attachment to any of these lower key films than anything in Lawrence of Arabia. I mean, I love Bridge and the River Kwai, but I think Lawrence of Arabia's, I don't want to say awful, but I do think it's one of the films that becomes an accepted classic, and then people just stop challenging it and asking, "Is it really?" Because I think it's
to interrupt you, it looks fantastic. There's no
yes,
doubt
I
about
think
its technical prowess, and it's a beautifully made film. But yeah, I would say that Lawrence of Arabia is quite a cold, not heartless film, but there's the emotional core in that
yes,
film
I
is
don't think
very much lacking for me personally.
yeah, I don't think it's got much to say about the human condition, about its subject matter, about the place and time. Um, I do think Bridge and River Kwai is the best of both worlds in terms of scope and the personal insight for David Lean. But I don't think he is the world class legendary director that some people do, or rather, if I do concede that, it will generally be for his 40s work, and then into the 50s rather than the 60s through the 80s, where Passage to India and stuff. I don't see him as being one of the old timers, which isn't to say that he's not great for what he does, but what he does, I don't think, is as remarkable an achievement as the cinematography of Jack Cardiff would suggest.
That is a very fair statement. Yeah, I haven't seen a huge amount of David Lean's work. I've seen the big hitters. I've seen The Bridge on the River Kwai, seen Lawrence of Arabia. This is my first time viewing Summertime, and I was very pleasantly surprised by the film. And I've seen A Brief Encounter. I think
Dr. Zhivago?
Not seen Dr. Zhivago. No, that's one I have not seen. Yeah, I'm not typically a big fan of like period piece epic things like that. I mean, there are exceptions, but that's something I'm going to have to be in a very specific mind space to want to sit down and watch a very long film like that. So I'll get around to it one day. But yeah, that's one that I haven't seen that I know is a very, popular and, critically lauded film. But yeah, so I was sort of excited to watch Summertime based on Mark Cousins' recommendation to see how similar it or any themes that could be, interconnected between Bad Timing. And as I said, I was quite pleasantly surprised. The first thing that struck me when I watched this film was the location, the way that the film is portraying Venice. So the basic plot summary or synopsis of this film is a sort of middle-aged woman played by Katharine Hepburn in a fantastic role. I think she's which charms the socks off me in this film. She, as I said, she's middle-aged. She describes herself as a fancy secretary from Ohio. So like middle America. So that gives some sort of context about her, her view on certain things in life, about maybe relationships and things like that, which come into play later in the film. And she's been saving a long time to go on a trip to her dream destination, which is Venice. And she is seemingly single. She has no children. And it's her journey in Venice, seeing the sights and experiencing the food and the culture there and stuff. And she perchance happens to have a meet cute of sorts with a local Venetian man. And from there, a relationship blossoms in a nutshell. And it's so progressive for the time. For a 1955 film, I thought there are some elements of it that have dated, perhaps, like the etiquette of like the dating situation. I feel like between a man and a woman is still very much set in that time period, but the film deals with some really interesting subject matter, particularly with in a country that is very Catholic, and there are a lot of holy structures that are photographed in the film. I don't know how you felt about like the progressiveness of like a woman in her I think Katharine Hepburn was probably in her late 40s when she filmed this. It was
Yeah,
very
so
unusual.
yeah, so what, 22 years after bringing up Baby and things. So she'd already been a massive star for a long, long, long time. So you're casting someone who's well known and has been well known for such a long time that it's almost shorthand for will now be middle aged, even if you didn't particularly think of her that way. I think the aspect of the film that's most interesting is as a pair is the location. We can get into that more when we can do the contrast and compare part. But why use that location? Why use the city to reflect someone's own feelings, own humanity back at them? Sometimes she doesn't see anything looking back at her. I mean, I have to say the film opens with a very jaunty score. And
Yes.
it kind of sets you up for a much more by Alessandro Cheganini. It's kind of preps you for maybe more of a comedy than I think you get. And I think there's some great humor in it, but it is, generally speaking, I wouldn't even call it a rom-com. I'd say it's more of a drama with comedic elements.
For sure.
And first of all, I have to say that from a Hammer point of view, the first person you see in this film is Andre Morel. He's the Englishman on the train at the start. And Andre Morel, if you are a Hammer horror fan, it's just like seeing Peter Cushing or Christopher Lee on that train for no reason. He's not credited. He's not in the credits at all.
Okay.
And there he is, just sitting there talking to Katharine Hepburn and then wishing her well as he gets on his boat and moves on up the canal. Probably off to some kind of gothic horror film of his own. You'll have to excuse me. There's werewolves up there. I think this film is again very simple. Like you said, it's a very simple plot, but it's very in depth in terms of what the character goes through of Jane. Yeah. As you said, she's come to Europe, to Italy, to Venice in particular, not just Europe, not just Italy, to Venice in particular. And you get the sense that this Jane that we're meeting at the very start of the film might very well be a new Jane. And that the secretary back in Ohio, in Akron, Ohio, is a very different person entirely. Because she shies away from everything. She likes the idea of romance, but the minute anything approaches her, and romance in every sense, she takes a step back.
Yeah.
She wants everything, but she doesn't quite know how to take that step. And it's quite a dark film from that point of view. If you just look at it from her emotions, it could go very, very wrong if she met somebody different in the piazza. Mm-hmm. As we know, in the Piazza San Marco, she has the good fortune to bump into what's his name in the film again? It's
Renato.
Yeah. She has the good fortune to bump into Renato. I was going to say Rossano, but that's his real name, Rossano Brazzo.
Yeah.
She has the good fortune to bump into him, and they have that meet cute, which I like that it's also not dressed up as they just fall for each other for no reason.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
He is sexually attracted to her, first of all. It's not just off. I don't care what you. No, he eyes her up, and the camera does go from ground up.
Yeah.
So it does take it back to more primal base instincts, which is interesting because we'll return to that later in their relationship. It's not going to be brief encounter. It's not going to be just the chaste relationship of that. It's going to be quite different.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about like how they meet, because obviously the camera from the point of Renato's perspective, he notices like her foot, and it follows like she's got like her bare leg is like visible and stuff, and the camera pans up, and then he's obviously noticing her and is attracted to her. But there's a lot of stuff to do with the production of this film, where the Italian government were at first very resistant to allow them to film on location for various different reasons. One of them was because of the people that man the gondolas. I can't remember what they're called. Just
Gondoliers,
something like that. Yeah, sounds right. Were basically going to strike because they were like, well, you're going to be shutting down parts of the canal so that we can shoot, and that's going to affect our income. So they were just going to basically strike all over the city because they didn't want a film crew to come in and basically affect their daily life and daily work, income and things like that. But then the United Artists basically gave a huge bribe of sorts. It was basically a bribe. They gave a huge chunk of money to the Italian government for the restoration of St. Mark's Cathedral, that allowed them to basically come and shoot there regardless of what was going to happen. So obviously the Italian government were bribed by the US to be able to come and actually shoot their thing there. But what I was going on to about was also to do with their deal of being able to shoot there. They weren't allowed to shoot anyone outside of like any holy buildings or anything that was sacred with like their bare arms showing or short skirts or anything like that. So it was part of the thing. But in the piazza, I don't know what exactly is around there, but there's obviously the cathedral that's maybe at the end of it. But obviously Katharine Hepburn has her leg out and stuff, and it's just an interesting thing that I noticed on this watch and doing some research about the production history. Like they made an agreement not to show skin. I mean, it's not like overly showing, but it's like from the perspective of this man noticing a woman's leg and like going and being attracted towards it and things like that. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, and Jane, and it is Jane's film.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not a duo, so you wouldn't have cast another big name in that male role. He's the perfect casting for this because Rossano was a bit of a star coming through. He'd just done 3 Coins in the Fountain, but he wasn't an A-lister by any stretch of the imagination. But if you cast another star in that role, then you're automatically going to make it a story of equals. So you have to kind of give Katharine Hepburn that platform. And it's based on a play as well, so it's clearly from her point of view. But you have to give Katharine Hepburn that platform to be able to tell it from the woman's point of view. It's very progressive in that regard, you're right. The aspect of her character that I did like was her running away from it more. But she always knows deep down that she's come all the way around the world for this relationship. In fact, not even just this relationship, any relationship, she needs human contact. It feels like, in any regard. She makes a great friendship with the young boy, Mauro. She wants to constantly go out for dinner with other residents at the hotel she's staying with, and then is quite embarrassed when they say, "No, it's a couple's thing," or we're meeting another couple, blah blah blah. And then when she finds out that the lady who runs the hotel is having an affair with one of the residents, she becomes very Puritan herself.
Yeah.
Which again hints that I think she's had quite a repressed background and she's come to find out who she really is. I'd imagine there's quite an interesting prequel in this to be told with Jane. How did she get this epiphany in middle age that she's going to become this? As Rato says to her at one point, everything comes sooner or later. And it feels that way. It feels like she's been waiting to become this version of herself, and probably waited a lot longer than she should have. She's waited a long time for that gardenia, that motif that we're presented with quite a few times in terms of representing their relationship. That's always just out of reach, but isn't it nice that you had it in the first place, which I guess is the point of the film. I mean, it's quite a remarkable relationship because I buy it even though they barely have any I shouldn't buy it. It's all done performances, the filmmaking, the look. I mean, it wouldn't work as well if you set this in Halifax, would it? I don't know why I picked Halifax.
Yeah, it's a very strange particular place to pick.
I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I've been saving all these years just to come through to Halifax. wouldn't quite work. But no, she's got these romantic notions, and she does get rewarded for that. She gets rewarded for believing in the idea of romance, for believing that there is something out there larger than her, and she was meant for it, and it was meant for her. And it's not what she thought it would be. Scarcely ever is. It's different, and it challenges her. She's frightened by it, but it's rewarding nonetheless.
Completely agree. Yeah, it's really just to follow on from like her background, or like our perceived, like we fill in the blanks of where she's come from. As I said, she's from like the middle America, so she probably has like a very conservative upbringing and stuff. But she meets a retired American couple on a boat when she first arrives in Venice, and they're obviously gallivanting around Europe. They list up all the places they've been, having a wonderful time, and then the wife just drops into conversation that they're able to do all this, or they've like been able to afford it because they haven't had any children. And the husband is like, "Oh, like don't say that out loud." It's not exactly what he says, but basically, it's something that maybe they should be embarrassed or ashamed of because they've got to this point in their life and they haven't got any children. But obviously, Jane doesn't have children either, and it's this sort of like expected like role of women like in society to have like get to a certain point in life and they become mothers, or they're homemakers or something like that. Like it was very interesting to see for the time period, like 1955. Like there still isn't a huge amount of films, as I said, with Katharine Hepburn being the lead in a romantic film. Like you just generally don't see older women in these roles, even to this day. I'm sure there are a few. None come to mind, but particularly it was just fascinating to see this. And yeah, the conservativeness of Jane's character and her being told by Renato like what people do. This is in reference to the hotel owner having an affair. Like her husband died in the war. She's probably a very lonely person, and society probably would say like this woman's husband has died and she should probably remain a widow and celibate for the rest of her life in memory of her husband. A very old way of thinking about things, but she's obviously having an affair with one of the residents in the hotel. But Renato is very progressive. Like he's not condoning their actions, but he's like people need this connection with people. Like sometimes they don't do it in the best of circumstances, but they're all trying to live. Everyone's trying to just have some sense of connection with people and just be alive. And sometimes that involves doing morally bad things in a lot of people's eyes. Like this man is cheating on his wife with the hotel owner, but it doesn't condone it, but it's just basically saying like people do these things out of various different reasons. And Jane realizing this, like Renato says, it's not your business like what these people do. Like why is it, how does it affect you? It's like just to do with all the conservativeness. And I was really interested to see how Renato sort of not convinced her, but we sort of did, because she was very much like, oh, I don't want to partake in this city, because she says something like, oh, this city changes at nighttime.
Something happens to this city at night.
Yeah, and I thought
I thought that was the line that linked these two films very much as well.
Okay, interesting. But yeah, and some other maybe not thematically things, but just some like movie trivia and stuff. That Katharine Hepburn falls into the canal at one point in the film. She's like filming. So during the whole film, she's quite, you could say she's voyeuristic at points. She's very like recording everything she's doing and observing people. And she goes back to visit Renato's antique store after meeting him for the second time, and she's very flustered in their second meeting as she recognizes him from the piazza. And she goes back, maybe getting the courage to think, oh, you know, actually, I did find this man attractive. I would like to have another conversation and see this guy again. And he's not there, so she's recording what she's like filming the store, and then she steps back into the canal. And she didn't want to do that to start with. There's no stunt double there. She wanted a stunt double to fall into the canal for her, but David Lean was like, well, people are going to obviously see it's not you, and it's just going to look really bad. So she was convinced to actually do the scene. She was covered in like Vaseline for some reason. I don't know what that was supposed to do. She looks very like slick and oily. I just thought that was just the quality of the water, because the canals and stuff, you see people chucking their rubbish at the beginning of the film, like, and obviously I guess the sewage is all just pumped into the canals there. So I've never been myself, but I know people who have been and say that there can be a bit of a smell in Venice. But she goes into the water and she has to film that scene 4 times or 5 times. So some accounts of the production have told, and she gets conjunctivitis from being in that disgusting water, and she had an eye condition for the rest of her life after that scene, which is like crazy that she, even though she didn't want to do the scene, David Lean convinced her to do the scene 4 times, no less. And from it, she was very concerned, like, well, the water is terrible, like it's disgusting water, no one should go in this water. And she did it, and then she had an eye condition for the rest of her life based on doing that. So, which is sad, but just an interesting bit of movie, trivia.
Yeah. To go back to a point you make about middle-aged women in film of this period, I think you can draw a parallel between her and the heroines of Douglas Sirk's films. I don't think this would be out of place in Douglas Sirk's filmography. He had plenty of heroines who were middle-aged women who repressed sexuality and then allowed it to blossom in spite of society. So I think this is just about the time that's starting to become more of a theme in American film. And interesting that neither Douglas Sirk or David Lean were American. So they bring that to American film, but it isn't American filmmakers doing so. In terms of Katharine Hepburn herself, what she brings to it as Jane, I mean, all sorts of old-fashioned words can be used to describe Katharine Hepburn in general, but she displays exactly all of these in the film. Vim, vigor, pep. She's very old-fashioned in terms of she's a handsome woman. You wouldn't describe somebody that way these days, but you can see why she was described as such back then. She's unusual. She has a different quality to her. And
that's even said in the film, isn't it? One of the characters are like, oh yeah, I'm beautiful. Like, she describes one of the woman who has her husband is cheating on her is like, oh, you're a very beautiful woman. And she's like, yeah, I may be pretty, but like, you're interesting looking. There's a difference. Like, there's a lot of beautiful people in this world, but they're not a huge amount of interesting people looking in the world. And so sort of like putting a lot more emphasis on the interesting part for Katharine Hepburn's character. So yeah, sorry to interrupt.
And then she has, I think, the most telling speech in the film, where she's telling the same young lady about why have you come here, basically. And then she makes up this character that she met in the boat, another young woman. And young is anybody under 50, by the way, as she tells us, which again is quite an interesting line, because that would definitely not be the notion at the time. So she's kind of defying that norm. But she says the girl in the boat was waiting to come to Europe to find something in the back of her mind. Remember that part? She's going in the back of her mind. Past seeing things and getting culture, that was up front around here. And it wasn't about perfumes, because that was over here. And it wasn't about anything. Well, we'll never talk about that.
Yeah.
That's a real cute moment. But then she jumps back into it and she says she was looking for a wonderful, mystical, magical miracle to find what she'd been missing all her life. And we know straight away she's talking about herself. There wasn't another girl on that boat. She's talking about herself, but she doesn't know it when it hits her in the face.
Yeah, of
She's
course.
so reluctant when she meets Renato, literally shoving him away. And he is, to be fair, very voyeuristic that first time as well, as she is, as you said, which again is something that I do think links these two films subtly. But he watches and doesn't approach. And he waits until the next time when she literally just happens to walk into his life. So there is that coincidence of that happening, of him opening or running the antique shop, rather. Otherwise, it might just have been a moment that they shared on the piazza one day.
Did you think in the moment where that the retired American couple, excuse me, come back to the hotel and they reveal that they've bought all these red goblets from the glass thing? Did you think that Renato had swindled her at that point? Like, did he have ulterior motives? Because I was, in my mind, I was like, oh, he's actually like an asshole. Like, for some reason, he just basically wants to get her into bed or something like that. And because I was like, well, what explanation could there be for all these red goblets to be everywhere? And obviously he explains
It's
that,
funny because I do take that to be the intention, obviously, that we're supposed to doubt at least his
of
intention.
course,
But then we know that's the case because he's also lying about his children, passing them off as nieces and nephews. So I don't know. I think there was a part of Renato that at first was just in it for oh, here's an American tourist. She might be good for a fling.
yeah.
And maybe that happens seasonally for Renato. That's how he gets through his separation and whatnot. And then it did start to blossom into something more because I don't doubt that either.
Yeah, me too.
Don't doubt for a second that they do have genuine feelings for each other at the end, and that the liberation that she finds through the relationship should give this ending a little bit of a downer. It should be a little bit more disappointing. It should have that more brief encounter ending where you're just heartbroken for these characters to have to go back to their lives. But really, I don't think he was ever supposed to be there for her permanently. I think that's he's there to have changed her, and she can go back as a new person.
Yeah.
Again, like I mentioned, potentially an interesting prequel in her story. There'd be an interesting sequel as well, because what does that look like when she goes back and tries to incorporate these very European attitudes into 1950s America, picket fences and Eisenhower? I don't know. And I guess that's why films stop at a certain point.
Yeah.
So that we can have something of a happy ending. It's not a overtly happy ending, but I think it's an emotionally satisfying one for both of them at least. They both accept it. It's not a downbeat ending. I have seen some describe it as a weepy, and I think no, that's Brief Encounter. You're completely mixing up the emotions here. This is poignant, but it's not a downer. They both kind of accept it was a summertime romance. It was literally their own little summertime madness.
Yeah, it was. It has that bittersweet feeling about it, and it's definitely summarized by what Jane says about it's better to leave a party before it finishes, because obviously their relationship was never going to go the distance. Like, they were never going to, like, it didn't seem that way. Like, I as you said, I truly believe that they've had strong feelings for each other, and they really wanted to spend time together, and what they had was real. But she lives in Ohio and he lives in Venice, and he has children and is separated and stuff, and it just wouldn't have worked out. But she had to go home when she had to go home, and it would have changed her life, and hopefully she would have I like to think she would have gone home and put herself out there and met someone, hopefully in back home. And so
And I love that the film also has these, what we think of as cliches, but this is one of the films that invented those cliches. Running alongside the train at the end.
Oh yeah.
The relationship being taken to the next step and then going to bed together and then literal fireworks erupting. I mean, you know, that's up there with train going into the tunnel montage. But,
yeah, not subtle.
but again, this is one of the films that invented that cliche. So when we think of that as a cliche, it's only because of the films like this. So we're getting that to as what at the time might have been slightly more subtle symbolism.
Yeah, of course.
I think there's even Jane taking off her shoe and leaving the one shoe and things. You know, it's obviously not going to show you her undressing and whatnot, but that's as good as for shorthand movie speak of the 1950s. Katharine Hepburn just taking off that one shoe and leaving it behind as they go back indoors under the fireworks. So it's good. I think it's a wonderfully upbeat celebration of potential. Of life, but it doesn't feel the need to have the ending, you know, the Hugh Grant ending, if you will, which would make it more of a rom-com, you know, if they did settle down, because I just can't imagine these two ever sitting down and him sitting in the white vests and them worrying about the rent and things. So there's an idealism behind it where
of course
it's almost like she knows she has to take away this version of her holiday and that will help her. But if she stayed there, she would just become an Italianized version of who she probably already was.
Yeah. It's going back to the consummation of their relationship with the fireworks and everything. They actually, it wasn't explicit because of the time, but they actually filmed a scene where like they go to the bedroom and things like that. But the Hays Codes was still in full swing in the 50s, you know. And they had to cut that scene, especially because the film was filmed in Italy and stuff. That with the agreement, adultery was a no-go. Like even in America, like adultery was generally like, we can't have this, even though the guy is separated from his wife and is not in a committed relationship with her. It's still like in the eyes of God and the law, I guess it's adultery. I don't know, but yeah. So the Hays Code.
Yeah, I mean, and it's fascinating too that it's Katharine Hepburn, because that was her life story with Spencer Tracy. Them being in a very long-term relationship and him never being able to marry her because he was already married and he was a strict Catholic.
Yeah,
and they lived together in sin, quote unquote. And they both had extramarital things as well, and there's all sorts of salacious things about old Hollywood types like that. But generally speaking, Katharine Hepburn probably saw a little bit more of the character of Jane in her than, say, I don't know, Ingrid Bergman would have, or Jane Russell. Insert 50s movie star here. I think Katharine Hepburn probably identified a little bit more with social norms keeping her down, and her as the epitome of 1930s movie star women who are fighting back against that cliche. I think it's very apt using her for that kind of battle to stand up for women of that era.
Well said. Is there anything else you want to cover on Summertime or Summertime Madness before we move on to Bad Timing?
Yeah, Jane's an absolute monster. She gives that child cigarettes.
I forgot to say that. I have got that written down in my notes. I was like, she's childless, and I'm like, she'd make a terrible mother.
Yeah. He's like, can I get a cigarette? No, you're too young to smoke. Can I really not have one? Oh, well, on you go then.
Yeah. And he's puffing away. I'm like, it's like that kid's smoking. Like,
yeah, like if he said something like, no, it's so I can hustle it or something, you'd believe it with that kid. But no, he sits there and just. And she's like, yes, smoke up, child. It's the 1950s and we know nothing of these cancers. It's like, that's rather that's probably the most dated thing in the film.
For sure.
I mean, there's small elements you can nitpick in terms of the social mores of the day. Katharine Hepburn has to play it as a very she's very nervous and looking over her shoulder and I love you, and then runs away. And but it's 1950s. We can't look at these things 70 years on, and there's a way that Hollywood has to tell stories and whatnot. So these, this wasn't an indie film or anything, so it wasn't going to break those kind of conventions. It was always going to follow something of a love story, traditional plot point, even if it's not quite what censors either in the Vatican or in Akron, Ohio would expect, or India, where it was also banned rather bizarrely.
Yeah,
I don't imagine it lost a lot of money at the Indian box office, and I don't think that would be a huge part of the David Lean industry, but regardless.
So shall we move on to Bad Timing? Are you ready for this?
But there's no bad timing for bad timing. Yeah, so let's move on to it.
So Bad Timing, 1980 film by Nick Roeg. Very controversial film. We'll get into it. First off, as I like to do with these things, discuss a little bit about your history with Nick Roeg.
Well, funnily enough, it probably comes from Mark Cousins, from Movie Drone back in its day. But yeah, from I don't know, 99, 2000, 2001, whenever it was, seeing Mark introducing, I think it would be Don't Look Now on Movie Drone. Because Nick Roeg was a massive favourite of Movie Drone. For anyone who doesn't know, Movie Drone was a 90s slot on BBC Two in which cult films or interesting films were shown, but they were given an introduction by, first of all, Alex Cox in the early runs, filmmaker of Repo Man and whatnot, and then Mark Cousins took over in the later 90s into the 2000s. And Mark is a massive Nicolas Roeg fan. I think he included Eureka on his Sight and Sound list. So I've always loved, Don't Let Now after seeing that for the first time a couple of years too young.
Yeah.
and then, which again, funnily enough, would be an alternate pairing, wouldn't it, with the How to Use Venice as a character in your film.
For sure.
But then that obviously leads to The Man Who Fell to Earth, which leads to Walkabout, which I think I'd already seen at that point and just didn't know it was Nicolas Roeg. Also, The Witches, I guess, would fall into that category. Yeah. When I saw that as a kid, I wasn't watching it as a Nicolas Roeg flick. Performance, Eureka itself, Insignificance. So in a relatively short amount of time, probably by the time I was 20, I'd seen just about all the greats of the Nick Roeg canon. And then, interestingly, of course, Nick Roeg had already worked, funnily enough, for David Lean.
That's right.
As second unit photography on Dr. Zhivago, on Lawrence of Arabia. So there's a nice link between the two as well. Whereas his films couldn't be more different if they tried.
Have you seen Track 29?
Yes, I have. I've got the indicator of it, yeah.
What do you think about that one as a side?
I think it's a good film, but like a lot of Nicolas Roeg's later films, he had to compromise to get it made. And you can see that in there, in terms of compromising in terms of budget, compromising in terms of casting, and then writing for we've got hopes for this new guy, so don't write Gary Oldman a certain way or do write him a certain way. Yeah. I think it's just a bit more compromised than Nick Roeg's 70s and then early 80s works. I think Insignificance is the last truly great thing he did. But that's not criticism, because those greats are just majestically great. Probably Don't Look Now, Man Who Fell to Earth, Bad Timing, Eureka, and Insignificance would be in my top 50 of all time. So 10% of my top 50 would be Nicolas Roeg.
That's impressive. So yeah, Bad Timing stars Art Garfunkel as Alex, and he's like a psychoanalyst working.
We should say psychoanalyst. You said psychoanalyst.
Yeah, I did that.
He's also a psycho.
Yes, he is.
Analyst, yeah.
And then Teresa Russell as Milena, and then a wonderful turn by Harvey Keitel as as the inspector investigating the case. So the brief synopsis of the film is Alex and Milena meet at a party and sort of have this very different sort of meet cute as we see in Summertime. You know, Melena's very much the instigator in the meeting and the being, you know, seductive. And the film is very weirdly, well, not weirdly, but jarringly, for especially for a first time viewing, that it's very chop and change between timelines. So there's a lot of
Very Rogan, yeah, very Nick Roeg.
Yeah, it's told through flashbacks, and the flashbacks are not necessarily told in chronological order and things like that. And yeah, so they start off a relationship, and things start to sour, and it's a very I'm not sure how to talk about this film. I'm when tell me about the first time you saw Bad Timing and what your reaction to it was, and then I'll reciprocate.
So it would have been 2002-ish. Wasn't as easy to track down as obviously Man Who Fell to Earth and blah blah blah. But when I got a copy of that, of Bad Timing, I remember watching it and finding it a very difficult film to comprehend in terms of what was happening for the first time, and then by the end credits, feeling like I knew absolutely everything about it. Where it rewards rewatches, but you have enough of an understanding after just one to know exactly what's going on. So I think it's a bleak film and quite a difficult film if you're not willing to roll with it. But if you are willing to just take things as they are, don't expect a straight narrative, then this film does reward in terms of it gives you an ending, which you wouldn't think this film would. All the build up. If you watch just the first 45 minutes and you've never seen a Nick Roeg film, you're going to be thinking, why is he doing this? What are all these jumps? And he doesn't use dissolves. He doesn't use fade outs. It doesn't use, that kind of cloudy effect to tell you we're into a flashback of it. He just cuts to it the same way you would cut from shot to reverse shot. So 1 second you're in the room with in present day, the next minute is 6 months ago, or maybe 6 months in the future, and you've got no idea. You just need to experience it, let it happen, and then piece it together while it's going along. And then by the end credits, I think it all rolls together into a hell of a satisfying narrative, which still asks a lot of questions, which is where the reward value comes in, but it gives you a satisfying watch regardless.
Yeah, 100% agree. It does sort of not make sense, but you definitely have a clearer picture of everything. It's very masterfully crafted. Like, I was never on my first viewing experience like bored or like put off by the style, but I was very intrigued as to say why is this being put like structured this way? Like, what is the purpose of this? And I think it's all to do with your memory is very important factor into this, and just being able to tell a story in that way definitely gives more impact to the conclusion of this film. So very, very controversial. We'll just take the cat out of a bag. There's a scene at the end of the film in which Art Garfunkel essentially has sexual intercourse with Teresa Russell's character while she is basically in a coma. And on the first time viewing this, I literally had like my hands in front of my eyes because I was so quite shocked at what I was watching. And this film has been described as like a sick film made by sick people for sick people. And I don't quite agree with that. I do think there are some disturbing elements to this film, but I can also see why some people may think that, depending on their particular outlook on things and what should or shouldn't be shown in film and cinema.
Yeah.
But it is shocking, but I do feel like the scene has a lot of merit, and it's definitely builds towards something of this nature. So as I described it earlier. The film is very much about their romance and their relationship. And Art Garfunkel's character Alex is a psychoanalyst who's very interested in Teresa Russell's character because she has this like wanton abandon. She's a very free spirit, but she also has like psychological issues of sorts, and she's like has problems with alcohol. And I think he uses her as, you know, academic research, or basically as he uses her as something of an experiment to like test her psychologically, like how far can he push her and how will she react to certain things that he does. And Teresa Russell is very much like in on their relationship. Like she believes that what's happened, what they're going through is like real. And but she's also very much like Katharine Hepburn's character. She's free spirited and she doesn't want to be tied down. And she loves Alex, but she doesn't want to marry him. You know, at one point in the film, they're on holiday in Morocco, I believe, and he asks her to marry him, and she's like, no, like why do we need to do that? Why can't we just enjoy each other and just have things the same way as they are now? Like, and obviously, Art Garfunkel is very much a controlling. Wants to own her, basically. He wants to understand her completely. The knowledge and all that thing feeds into his sort of scientific mind, a very disturbed scientific mind. But it's all about, you know, getting things from someone, and he thinks that he can basically get everything that he wants to knowledge-wise from Milena. And it's where the rewatchability comes in, as you said, because you just, when you watch all these scenes again, knowing how things end up, how everything concludes, you can see all these tiny little threads of where he's trying to pick apart at her brain and try and, you know, pull her apart and find out exactly what makes her tick, and you know, rub her the wrong way and just see how she reacts. And it's just fascinating. I will say that Nick Roeg likes to cast musicians in his films. You know, obviously he's got Mick Jagger in Performance, and you know, David Bowie in Man Who Fell to Earth. So he had a sort of thing about people who like to perform. You know, obviously these are like very well celebrated musicians and, you know, frontmen and singers who like to be in front center stage and to perform in a certain way. And there is some, you know, things about this film where Art Garfunkel and Teresa Russell didn't want to participate after a certain point in the film. They were in production for a few weeks, and they were like, I'm really not sure what we're doing here. I don't feel confident in the story, and is this a bit too much? Especially Teresa Russell. She was very young. She was like 23 when she filmed this. So, but, you know, Nick Roeg convinced them, like, I have a plan, and no, just please trust in what I'm doing, because he described the film as like I can't say this word, labyrinthian, or it's very much like a labyrinth. It's because of all the cuts, all the jumps in time. It can be disorientating, but at the end of it, you do come to the center of the labyrinth. You know, there is an end game to this. Like, it's not all just to confuse people and to be arty for the sake of it. There is a reason for the structure, but obviously it took some convincing for these two actors to continue participate, because they were really unsure of Nick's vision, and I'm very glad that he convinced them to do so. But yeah, so controversial.
If they said, if he said to them, "I want you to treat it like a labyrinth," I'd say, "You're not listening to David Bowie now, man. This is he was in your other movie." I don't know. For all the controversy and whatnot, we come back to the old depiction is not endorsement thing.
Yeah, of course.
Where this is not a sick film, and it's not made for sick people, by sick people. Nick Roeg, to know his filmography, he did depict darker sides of life, but realistic sides of life. They weren't made up. They weren't too far out there. They were parts that we all have inside of us, to a certain extent or to a lesser extent, depending on who you are. I mean, the whole film starts just like the last film starts with that wonderful peppy score. This film starts with Tom Waits' Invitation to the Blues, from the majestic Small Change album. And what a great scene setter that is in terms of whose invitation is it? At the start, you think it's Theresa Russell's.
Yep.
And as the film develops, you realise it's Art Garfunkel's.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be.
Yes, it could, yeah.
And again, there's just like the last film, there's a separate prequel to this where it's Denham Elliott's.
Yes, of course.
The ex or the still kind of husband. Or it's the potential next guy, depending on how you interpret the ending. And it could also be about 5 other guys at the same time, as we see Theresa Russell's character having little flings where we just see a guy waiting for in the scenes and then we never see that guy again. So we get the notion that she's having these small affairs all over the place, because it just feels right at the time. And there's so many parts of this film that that really, I think, are integral to understanding it. And I don't quite get why major film critics didn't. And I mentioned to you last week, I think it was, Roger Ebert savaged it. Absolutely savaged it. As he was wanting to do with anything outside of the mainstream quite a lot of the time, where he criticised the film for the kind of things we've been talking about, but then also criticised the film for the editing in terms of the time and the narrative structure, which he said was a gimmick. And it was only because the film wouldn't be interesting otherwise, which I think that's just nonsense. Absolute nonsense. This film has to be told that way because it's how Alex is coming to terms with it. Yeah. It's almost like he's misremembered his whole relationship until he's forced to relive it.
There's an element of like the unreliable narrator. You know, obviously we don't have any narration, but obviously the story is told through Alex's memories of everything. But I always have that feeling, because I've seen this film maybe 6-7 times now, and I always have that thing of like, is what he remembering how things really happened? You know, there's the scene where they meet after a period of like being separated in like the university campus or whatever it is, and the film goes extremely melodramatic. There's extreme soft lighting. There's this like sort of like soapy sort of type of music score going over the top of it, and they're like the cinematography is so soft, like you can see like glistens in their eyes, and I'm like, he's remembering things, but I'm like, because it's so dreamy, I'm like, is this how things happened? And like the audio is purposefully out of sync of what's happening, and then also you hear in their mind what they're thinking before they say it, and then they say it, and it's just, I just think it's masterful. I just absolutely love it, and I don't understand the criticism of the style, because I think it's absolutely wonderful. So
yeah, I genuinely don't know how anybody, especially a film critic like that, could possibly see this film and surely be familiar with at least Don't Look Now, and not realise that that's a very Nick Roeg thing to do with narrative. I mean, the most famous sex scene in cinema, maybe, is that Donald Sutherland Julie Christie scene in Don't Look Now, where he does exactly that. He uses editing to jump forward and backwards in time.
Yeah.
Where they're having sex, but at the same time, we're also watching them getting dressed afterwards.
Yeah.
So Nick Roeg has always used that. I mean, it's quite a famous thing about Nick Roeg that he was fascinated the first time he saw film getting edited, that you can just jump backwards and forwards in time. It's like time travel, was his famous quote. And the idea of not recognizing that and thinking that he just did that because it made the film interesting, because it wouldn't be interesting as a straightforward narrative, I think that completely misses the point, in that this is never going to be a straightforward narrative. It's not as if this was ever just going to be an A to B to C to, and then through to Z. It was always going to be something completely different, because Nick Roeg doesn't compose that way, if you will, to use another medium. He doesn't think that way. Nick Roeg does think in terms of these fractured moments where memory, where past, present, future can collide and not all reconcile at the same time, but you can jump to anyone at any point instantly without the need to, again, use blurring and use cuts and fade outs and wipes and whatnot. The shorthand of film, as people have been conditioned. Nick Roeg was happy to say that's not how the human mind works. We can just remember a holiday in France 20 years ago in the blink of an eye and be there and see it in our mind's eye. And he jumped straight to that. And I just don't understand how film critics can't at least see that, if not think it's a good thing. I don't understand how someone like Roger Ebert couldn't at least see that as part of Nick Roeg's aesthetic.
Yeah, it's like it's his language, it's his cinematic language, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sure.
So it just does not make sense. As his other criticism doesn't make sense, where he said, why is this film set in Vienna? Why not? Because he thought that this film was just set there because they could go on a holiday. I don't get that at all. I mean, you're setting it very consciously in Soviet era, in a place that's just been returned to Western hands, in a place that is covered with spies, which is one of the cities in which a lot of Cold War activity did occur, where agents from both sides would be all over the place. And just like our last film, it's an ancient city that on the face of it is absolutely gorgeous. And then when you delve down just a little bit under the surface, we see all this decay, and into the weeds, we see this darkness of secrets and lies and backstabbings and betrayals, and that somebody like Harvey Keitel has to exist in a purgatory like this almost. It needs a ferryman like Harvey Keitel, his character. Where I just don't think that this film works in quite the same way if you set it in Halifax. But yeah, I don't see those criticisms at all. I mean, I'm sure there are perfectly valid criticisms of this film to be made. It's just that I don't recognize them in any of the ones I've heard so far, ever.
Yeah, I agree. I think the use of the city of Vienna is probably more symbolic and has more meaning than it does in Summertime. But obviously, I think Summertime is captured and photographed in a more obvious way. But definitely, like, the underpinning of Vienna is definitely has more subtext to it, and definitely carries maybe more weight to it in the relationship between them. As you said, like the espionage and the spies, and it, being a hotbed of that sort of thing in the period. It definitely adds. Obviously, spies are voyeurs. They use to view and that's a theme of the film. So yeah, to say that Vienna has no purpose in this film is very short-sighted. I think it's wonderfully used. This film is very smart, like intellectually. Like, for this viewing, as I said, I've seen it like 6 or 7 times. I had to do a little bit of research into like the use of pieces of art in the film, because I like art, but I'm not like hugely into like knowing pieces of artwork's name or who painted these things and stuff like that. I know some of the big famous ones, but like I didn't know. In the gallery at the beginning of the film, as we open, with that Tom Waits track, which is fantastic, we have an artist's work on display. I guess it's a gallery of his work, of a Viennese artist called Gustav Klimt. And he was a very controversial artist, and he was very much obsessed with the female body, and a lot of his artwork was quite erotic, and he was very much shunned from society. I think he was like around like the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, but he's he sort of like started just to work for himself after a period of time, because he was just so fed up of like people calling him out on his work. And that definitely sets the theme, as one of the first few images we see is like one of his pieces of artwork called The Kiss, and it's quite an erotically charged piece of work, and it definitely sets the tone about what we're going to see. Like, the film is controversial, and the first thing we see is a historically controversial artist piece of work. And then I just think that's quite an intellectual thing. I didn't know it because I had to research it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like, you can completely enjoy all of these things without having like the subtext of the art, but then it just adds an extra layer. Like, if you happen to know who this artwork is by and the history of the person, or even if you see it and then you want to know more, you can do your research, and then you can add in all these layers into the film when you rewatch it. As you said, this film rewards rewatch so much. I wouldn't say it's a hugely rewatchable film, even though I've seen it 6 or 7 times. The first time I saw it was probably about 15 years ago, so it's not like I watch it all the time, but once every couple of years I'll be like, I'm in the mood for bad timing. If you've seen this and you're listening or watching this video and you go, how are you in the mood for bad timing? Like, it's such a, heavy film, but I'm just so overly like impressed by just the whole coming together of this film. It does have a controversial elements to it for sure, but I'm not watching it for those particular moments. It's just the craft, and I do think the acting in this film is very good. Harvey Keitel in his supporting role is just sublime. I love him in this film so much. He was cast at like the last minute. I don't know who they had set up before, but he was literally cast like a week or two before the film they went to Vienna to film. So he was very much last minute addition to the cast, and his there's a lot of parallels between him and Alex, which I found really interesting as well, on different sides of morality. But very, very interesting.
Or the same side of morality.
Well, there's that as well. There are some lines being blurred between when he's investigating and he wants to understand the psyche of him.
Yeah, although I will slightly disagree that that this film isn't eminently rewatchable. I did watch it quite a lot in a short space of time, because I do think it does reward that. The more you watch it in a short space of time, the more you will pick up on things, the small moments. I mean, there's the obvious ones that you'll pick up on straight away. Why do Alex and Harvey Keitel have the same picture up in the wall? Doesn't matter what the picture is. I think the most important thing to take away, that you wouldn't know when the scene's happening, but you'd only know it at the end, which is again why the rewatch is important, is that Art Garfunkel's putting his on display, Harvey Keitel's putting his away and hiding it. And you don't know until the end of the film just what Harvey Keitel... You just think he's the cop. If it wasn't played by Harvey Keitel, you'd be wondering why they bothered casting Harvey Keitel. Until that last 10, 15 minutes where he gets to come to the fore a lot more and show his own darkness. And then you realise why he would put his painting away when Alex is displaying his, because he's hiding who he really is. There's a very Rogan notion that he is just, Harvey Keitel is just a bad day away from being Alex himself. He's got that great speech at the end about ravishment, which is
that's right.
one of the key words of the film. The feelings of love used by hatred. Somehow, I think Alex says, somehow I get the feeling we're talking about you and not me, which again, yes, we are in that moment. And then Harvey Keitel very essentially puts his hand on Alex's arm. Doesn't just put his hand on his shoulder or anything. Puts his hand very essentially on his near enough holding hands almost. And says, we're not unalike. And he says he would understand if Alex has done these terrible things, to Weezer Russell's character. And talks about this disorder, this chaos that she's created, the vacuum that he has to make sense of. Alex has to make a moral and physical sewer, and describes her as a dangerous creature, danger to themselves and to others. They envy our strength, our capacity to fight, our will to master reality. They try and drag us down into their confusion and their chaos. And that kind of tells you where Harvey Keitel's character is coming from, where he is a much, much darker, voyeuristic character than you think in the first half of this film. About halfway through, you start to have moments of again, this is where I don't understand why the criticisms of the narrative structure can come from. Harvey Keitel was literally watching them having sex, even though it happened weeks or months earlier. But the camera angle in the room of him looking at the bed cut straight to the same angle of them in the bed months earlier, weeks earlier, whenever it was. And it's as though he's watching them. Similarly, when they have an incredibly dark encounter on the stairs, which is not far off what that end scene is. Harvey Keitel is watching them through the narrative structure of the film, through the cinematic language.
It's where the voyeurism stuff comes in. Yeah, of course, it's all in his mind's eye, but it's
but he's seeing it as clearly as we are. That's why you don't do fade-ins, you don't do dissolves. He's seeing it vividly. He can picture every single thing that we're seeing here, as vividly as we're seeing it on celluloid. So, and he would only be open to do that if he was dark too. So his voyeurism, the voyeurism of Alex, does parallel, I think, some of the voyeurism in a much darker way, of course, of Summertime, of the observation of that person you fancy, or in this case, in fact, I think you can make a case that Harvey Keitel does have some kind of, if not romantic fascination, certainly a fascination with Art Garfunkel. And it might even be romantic, because again, he does that very sensual gesture on his arm. There are all sorts of lines in this, which it's not a very lengthy script in terms of, no scene goes on too long in terms of this is the big explosive scene. There's a lot of small explosions, if you will, of emotion, eruptions. But there's not one big Kramer versus Kramer-like thing. It's lots of these small moments where, again, something happens to the city at night. Right back to the scene you're talking about of looking at the paintings, where Theresa Russell says they look happy, and Art Garfunkel says, well, that's just because they don't know each other well yet. Which very much tells you Alex's worldview, that things will just decay the longer they go on. Sitting in a grand old city that indeed has decayed as things have gone on, has fallen. And then there's that line, I've spent a very good chunk of my life trying to understand what normal means, and I still don't. Alex is not normal, as we know by the end, but then challenges you by saying, here's Harvey Keitel, the law and order of this town, and he's not normal either. What's normal? Do you know what it means? So it's just so Roegian. Judge not, yet lest ye be judged. Never in a religious sense, but always in a kind of, who are you? Who are you to judge? Just like we saw again in Summertime.
Well said. I do think there are some other shocking moments in this film, like Theresa Russell's, Melena's like surgery that she has, like the tracheotomy or whatever she has, like to she can't breathe. She's obviously ODing. So the plot point of she's very what's the word I'm looking for? She's very spontaneous, but like she does things that are not necessarily true happening. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but basically she calls up Alex and is basically like, I'm ending it all. She doesn't exactly say that, but she's saying, I'm calling to say goodbye. I've taken a bunch of pills or whatever, and that's it. I'm gone. So see you later, basically. And Alex is like, oh, he records his conversations. Like every time when he has a conversation, he likes to archive things. I think archiving is very much an important theme in here as well. Like I can't put my finger on exactly what Nick Roeg is trying to say about that. I think it's got something to do with memory and retaining knowledge. Obviously, Art Garfunkel's an academic, and like knowledge is power for him. Basically, it's a lot of his power comes from, or his self-importance comes from. So obviously in Alex's office, he has loads of like archive like folders, and he's got lots of books on display. And he records all the conversations that he has seemingly with everyone. You're not sure, but he definitely has conversations with Milena. He's obviously working for the government to spy and do some work on people, as we see in one of the films and one of these scenes. And he just so happens that he's having to investigate Milena for some reasons related to her ex-husband or her husband. And yeah, it's just fascinating. I don't know how to praise this film enough. I feel like you've had a better grip on what to say about what makes this film tick better than me today. I don't know. Sometimes when you love a film so much, it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what about it you love. But for me, it's the narrative structure and the craft of memory and time and recounting things and coming to terms with your actions, and yeah, just wonderful.
I think a lot of it is there in black and white as well. As much as
Yeah.
a lot of it is open to interpretation, a lot of it is there on the screen. The note, if you will, that she leaves at the end, saying, "I wish you would understand me less and love me more."
Yeah.
That's very telling. So you're right. Alex collects knowledge. He needs to constantly know everything, which is again why we have these flashback, jump forward, and whatnot, because it's all constantly living in the present for Alex. He probably imagines that everything's very vivid for him, although as we know at the end, I don't think he even remembers doing that as vividly as, I don't think this is a straightforward attempted murder, for example.
Yeah.
I think in his mind's eye, it probably was a kind act that he committed at the end, and we need to. That's why we need the depiction of it to come to that conclusion for ourselves about what he actually did. That there's no nobility in it, and what he did was just horrendous. And then we get other lines where they're in the car, and they have the argument. They have quite a lot of, again, smaller options of argument, and when they're talking about her marriage to Denham Elliott, again, both two characters, one in each of these films, have a secret marriage that they haven't disclosed to their partner. She says, I don't think it was a lie. It's just words. It's not important.
Yeah.
So it's actions are important and not words, because words can bury you. So yeah, which again does tie in, I think, to the other film. And she asks, "I'm worried you wouldn't like me anymore," and Alex doesn't deny it.
Yeah, of course.
It doesn't deny it. He just says something like, "I just wish things were like they were in the beginning," which could very easily mean the beginning of the film.
Yeah.
Rather than the beginning of the relationship, could just as easily mean that. Yes, it's because Nick Roeg makes films. It doesn't make things that could then be turned into stage plays or could be turned into books, or some of them could be, but he makes films. So he's speaking the cinematic language. So he's very, very much focused on that. And I think for film critics like Roger Ebert, I think it was The Guardian who had that quote, wasn't it? Or was it even Sight and Sound who did say the sixth film for six? Yeah. It was one of the major publications. For them to not see that in Nick Roeg's work, it just baffles me. To see this as another whistle stop in the wonderful career of Nick Roeg to that point, where it takes all the themes that he'd been working towards, and it just expands them greatly. If a playwright did that, they'd be praised to the heavens for taking the theme and running with it and exploding it. Whereas Nick Roeg, they just seem to think he's just a pervert, or he's making film the same way they would talk about slasher films or something, wrongly as well. I think it's very easy to do that, to criticize just because why are they doing that, and instead of asking yourself, well, why don't you ask why are they doing that? Really ask, and try and find an answer, because there is one. Nick Roeg didn't just think, Vienna might as well be.
Exactly.
I mean, sometimes, they just get a tax break in these countries. But it's a very conscious choice, as is his style, as is the casting. He's intentionally cast Art Garfunkel here, who we know is obviously a legendary musician, well, singer, not musician. No, he wasn't a musician. Paul Simon was, but had also, of course, been a film star for a brief period with Carnal Knowledge.
Yeah.
So he's using the shorthand of casting both a performer from another medium, but also someone who's done one very adult film before. He wasn't just casting Art Garfunkel out the blue. Art Garfunkel's already done one quite erotic adult film.
Yeah, I mean, this film was slapped with an X rating. I mean, this is crazy. And then, you know, the rank films, or was it Rank Organization? I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah. They dropped their logo from the distribution because they were like so appalled that they didn't want their name attached to it. So, you know, and it definitely affected distribution. And you know, I've read some interviews with people who have interviewed Nick Roeg, like in the years since Bad Timing came out, and he was always like, well, how did you see the film? Like, you must have bootlegged it, because where, you know, this was before like VHS and DVDs. So like, well, in the middle of the 80s and stuff, but even still in the 90s, it would have been bootlegged stuff because it didn't have distribution until, I know the Criterion put it out in the early 2000s on DVD. And obviously we have in the UK, the network, which you're holding up there and it's behind me there, Blu-ray, which I will say I do think needs some work doing to it. I don't know if it's just the elements that they have to work with, but I do think there are some imperfections in the transfer. Definitely doesn't impact my enjoyment of the film. I just think there are some inconsistencies with some color grading and things like that.
I think some of them are intentional.
Do you reckon? I don't know.
One of them definitely is. I know that for a fact. It's mentioned in reviews where literally in the middle of a scene, it'll cut from Harvey Keitel being nice to being suspicious. The blue teal comes on all of a sudden.
Okay.
Which, yeah, we could now just look at and think, oh, what's wrong with the color grading on this now that we're all very literate in the ways of quality control on Blu-rays. But yeah, a lot of it was, I think, either intentional or still works anyway. But regardless, I do think the general overall transfer could use more of a treatment, as indeed the Blu-ray overall could. You know, image gallery and a wonderful conversation with Jeremy Thomas, the great British producer, but who was no stranger to fighting battles over controversial films. It was a massive reason why David Cronenberg's films got so big. He fought for them to get major.
He produced Crash, right?
Yes, he did. Yeah. And Naked Lunch. So Jeremy Thomas is someone who was up for that fight. He wasn't just the film producer looking for a quick buck. He was somebody who supported esoteric filmmaking and unique film, people with a voice, something to say. Yeah. And just like Cronenberg, Nick Roeg would be somebody who is a very easy target to say, oh my goodness, there's sexualized nudity in this. It must be horrendous. And think of the children, why don't you? And you think, well, are you really such a, you know, just like our Italian character in the last film says, like, none of your business. Like, absolutely none of your business what goes on behind closed doors. And then Harvey Keitel kicks the door down and basically says it can be our business if we want to make it our business. So that's where the voyeurism aspect comes into it, I think, where some of these films, some of the parts of Bad Timing and a little bit of Summertime show you we're watching things that we're not supposed to see, shouldn't see, etc. Certainly in Bad Timing, I think that translates to the film itself, where we're not just watching Alex or we're not just watching Harvey Keitel looking. In fact, there's a great line in it I forgot to mention about spying. Remember, he's giving the lecture? He says, spying, or to give it another name, looking, that tells you where Alex's mind is at. Yeah. To conflate the two, just to look at something is automatically to spy on it. So just like that, we are conditioned to look at these horrendous scenes dispassionately of what happens at the end of the film. And Nick Roeg's kind of challenging you on it, but at the same time, he's still saying you need to see it to come to your own conclusions about what's happened to her. You really do. You can't be judge, jury, and executioner without seeing exactly what happened in this version of it, at least.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the one scene that definitely did happen, is that last scene. Everything else might be a little bit open to interpretation, but that's the one scene that definitely happened. And it took Harvey Keitel's cop to shake it out of Alex for one truth to finally be revealed.
Wonderful stuff. So, yeah, did you want to maybe share your thoughts on why this is a good or maybe not a good pairing, as was programmed by your very good friend Mark Cousins?
By my son. I'm 93. I'm Northern Irish. I think it is a good pairing because it takes a lot of themes in terms of setting, in terms of using decaying ancient cities and their reputations and either turning them their head or celebrating them or falling into their own traps. And then it takes the outsider's perspective of why that would appeal to you. So why would Alex want to be in Vienna? Why wouldn't he just take that scholarship in New York, whatever? And likewise, voyeurism is all over them. Voyeurism in an innocent way, which leads to positive revelations about yourself, or voyeurism in a dark way that leads to dark revelations about yourself. Because again, I don't think Alex is 100% aware of what he's doing is morally corrupt in Bad Timing. So voyeurism.
There is that moment. There is that thing where he's in when we actually get to the controversial scene, there is that build up and that very quick editing of him contemplating what he's about to do. Like, he's not 100% sure like he's going to do what he does. He's very much like, should I, shouldn't I, like, is this wrong, is this not, I'm not sure, I want to do this, but then should I? Like, I do think he's leaning towards, yes, this is something I'm going to do, but I do think he has something in the back of his mind that's stopping him from doing it, just from the way it's edited, and him he takes his coat off or his shirt off, or whatever, and then he's looking down at her, and it's just all very. And it's interesting how there's the foreshadowing I forgot to mention of when they first meet, Alex is tapping on his thumb the pen knife, and then that's the knife that he uses to take her clothes off in that scene. Is very interesting. Anyway, go back to you, Davy.
And Alex twirls his hair in a very certain way when he's lying as well. He'd be a hell of a poker player. Be very easy to take him to the bank. The themes of class are in a lot of Nicolas Roeg's work, but I don't think are quite as present here. No. But I think normality is. So Alex is definitely a middle-class person. He's a professor in Vienna, for goodness sake. Very literate, very well-read. It's not holding him to account for that like other Nicolas Roeg films would. So I think some Roeg themes that he normally goes with can actually be taken out of the situation. But in this case, I think it's down to location and what the location means, down to voyeurism, down to people wanting to be a different version of themselves. There's so many splinters you could take it from Bad Timing alone in terms of theme. And then some of them, I think, in Summertime would be a bit too much of a stretch to attach to. You don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole and start attributing things that just don't exist or just to make them match. But I definitely think there's a resonance, there's a DNA between the two, which is what I like in a double bill. I hate a double bill which is like watching the same film twice. What's the point? Might as well watch Bad Timing twice, and then it is eminently rewatchable. To take just themes of location and neuroses and voyeurism, I think is perfectly valid in terms of what links these two films, because that might be the where the train departs, but obviously the locations are very different in the end.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and especially on the subject of a double feature, like what makes a good one. There's so much debate about how, like, what makes a good pairing and stuff like that. Like, you can't just have two films that have no. I mean, you can if you want to. I mean, I've done it. I've watched films back to back that have no commonality or themes that are shared between them, and had a great time. But like, if you want something that is in conversation with each other, not necessarily in the same room, talking face to face, but they could be one end of a hallway and shouting various different things to each other, but they're still having a conversation, and there's still some sort of themes. And as you said, location. Voyeurism is probably the one that I would go to the most, especially with the whole things with spies, and particularly in the meet cute in Summertime, and just the observations that David Lean has there in that film. And I really like this pairing. A lot of people, I think, will think, well, this isn't a good pairing, but they're so different, but then still have things, the approach that they come from, as you said, with location and things like that. It's just done in a different way, and they just counterbalance each other. They're like, I think I can't remember if I said it on the episode or before we started recording, but I would definitely watch these Bad Timing first and follow it up with Summertime as the chaser, because you want to sweeten the bitter pill that is Bad Timing, with the, even though Summertime is bittersweet, it definitely has a positive message, as you alluded to earlier. And Bad Timing is just more of a reveal of the dark side of humanity, whereas Summertime is more of a celebration, or like a reveal of what people can have potential, things, the good stuff in life, and just celebration of sorts. So I definitely think they're a good pairing in that respect.
Well, also beginnings. So Art Garfunkel literally has that, as I mentioned, line about why can't we go back to the way things were at the start. And what does Katharine Hepburn do? She cuts the relationship short so that they only have the start.
Yeah.
So if they'd have done the same in the Theresa Russell Art Garfunkel relationship, they could have had Summertime, and instead they just have Madness.
Yeah. I like that. That was very well put.
Well, the pun was devised in the 1950s. I just
yeah. So is there any last thoughts that you want to share before we wrap up the episode?
Just that the cinema of Nicolas Roeg is amongst the greatest in all of film, and people should really just start a performance and go through at least till Insignificance in 1985, and just soak it up. And if it doesn't hit you, but you think there's something there, and it's just not quite, just keep bloody going with it. Just keep going with it, and it will just strike you one day. It's the penny will drop with Nicolas Roeg, and I think that the prudish nature of the reception that it got probably has kept it back a lot of this time. But I think Bad Timing deserves more of a limelight, and hopefully, because what will happen the minute Criterion put it out, there'll be 100 videos on it within a day saying how great it was, and people have always loved it.
Yeah, and we'll call them out and go, no, because you're not talking about it now. We are, because we're putting out a podcast on it because we love this film, and that's why we chose it, because we wanted to champion this, because it really is a film that especially Nick Roeg's filmography, it's been really quite hard to see. And now that that network Blu-ray is out of print, network sadly have gone the way of the dodo. Who knows if this is going to get picked up at any point to be released by another company. So yeah, I love this film. I think it was a great pairing. I think this has been a very good conversation, Davy. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. Do you want to share with our listeners and viewers like where people can find you and what you do?
No.
Okay, cool, excellent. Right, we'll call it there then.
That's my business. No, I'm not one of these like, share, subscribe, promote types. No, my channel's just whatever I want it to be tomorrow. So
okay, then I'll promote your channel then. So Davy has a wonderful channel where he talks about film and music, and he's built up a bit of a following on there. And I typically watch the film stuff because I don't watch a lot of music stuff on YouTube, but I do occasionally watch some of that stuff. And I'll leave the link in the description below, because Davy is definitely a voice that more people should be paying attention to, because I think he has a lot of authentic and honest things to say about the stuff that he covers on his channel. So,
well, even the lies are authentic, Sam. But it's not bashfulness. The videos are all wonderful, but I just have no interest in self promotion.
That's fair. That's fair.
The wonder can speak for itself, really.
Awesome. Well, again, it's been a pleasure, Davy. Yeah, we'll sign off there until next time, everyone. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, one last thing before we sign off. I had a question. I had someone message into the podcast, which I've only ever had once in the whole of this thing. It's got really nothing to do about the subject we're talking about. I mean, how would they know what we're talking about? No one knows that this is going to be coming out until it drops. But I had a question from a listener by the name of Claire, who asked me, and I guess whoever I had on as my guest, have you ever been to a film festival? And is there any film festival that you haven't been to that you would absolutely love to go to?
Yeah,
do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I'm in Scotland, so I go to the Edinburgh Film Festival most years, which is probably the first time I ever met Mark Cousins in person, funnily enough. Was it the Edinburgh Film Festival? It's where he lives. They're in Edinburgh. His address is no, and then in Glasgow we have our own film festival. So yeah, it's quite hard to avoid actually up here. If you live in one of the two major cities, at least seeing some film festival stuff. In terms of the bigger film festivals, I would have no interest in going to Cannes. Absolutely none whatsoever. That talk about voyeurs and whatnot. A place of depravity, and not even the good kind. No, I have no interest in one of those. Are they going to boo or not? Being the interesting thing. No. Venice, funnily enough, is supposed to be a magnificent festival, and you can always find love in Venice. And Toronto, TIFF.
Yeah,
Toronto,
I was going to say TIFF. I hear a lot of podcasters who I follow speak very fondly of TIFF, so I'd love to one day make it over there.
And then I guess the Tribeca Film Festival in New York, Ace in a Slice, and with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino or whatever. But yeah, what about you?
No, I've never been to any.
What about the Peterborough International Film Festival?
I'm working on it. No, I'd love to go to, like, I love all sorts of film, but I have like a soft spot for like indie and like not low budget horror films, things that don't get like a big budget and need help with the distribution and stuff. And like Arrow Film put on Fright Fest every, it's coming up actually, bank holiday weekend in August, and I was meant to go last year, but things got in the way and I can't afford it this year. So one year I will go to that festival, because they usually have some sort of premiere of some sort of horror film at these sorts of things, and it's just stacked with loads of like cool indie horror gems that I would love to go and see. And it's like independent enough that it's not crazy. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, if someone paid for me to go to Cannes, I would. I don't think I'd pay for myself, because it just seems extortionate for that sort of thing, as you said, with the will they boo or not. I just think it's extremely disrespectful. That's not the sort of film culture I want to be a part of, to be honest. If you don't like something, like booing someone just seems a bit much to me. But yeah, Toronto International Film Festival seems like something I would really enjoy. And yeah, so hopefully that answers the question, Claire. Thanks for writing in. It's nice to have someone who listens to the show write in. I mean, if anyone wants to put in the comments below or here, or message me personally on Instagram or anything like that, please do, and we can get your questions answered in future episodes. So
or
we'll call it.
Contact us on Thread. Wait, are we on Threads? Is Threads even a thing anymore? Go to Sam's MySpace. It's very active. MySpace and Bebo.
Yeah, we'll go with that. So we'll leave it there. Thanks, Davy. And yeah, it's been a pleasure. And until next time, everyone, take care.
Ciao.
Bye now. Ciao, Bella.